Microsoft Build 2020 is kicking off, and they're actually focusing on developers, which is kind of a weird thing in itself. We're here with Mary Jo Foley to give us a rundown of, the 20 to 50 announcements they're doing. Hey, Mary Jo, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Larry. Yep, that's not an exaggeration. As usual, there's a million announcements at Build.
So I guess walk me through high level here. Developers are, obviously the focus of Build, but probably I'd say the last 3 or 4 years, Build had the scope creep and, developers were kind of left scratching their head. So I guess what's the big picture here for Build?
Yeah, I know. I feel like it was the same for everybody, right? Like Apple also, and Google, Amazon, everybody wants to talk to developers, but then when they get these dedicated developer events, they also want to use them to show off their glitziest, newest stuff, right? They don't want to just make it about Visual Studio and C++. They want to say, hey, look at our drones and look at our AR and our VR, right? So this year at Build, I feel like it's finally back to focusing on their core audience, which is developers. And so I think you're going to see not as many glitzy announcements, but you're going to see things that the audience will care a lot about around development tools and how to use the cloud for development, how to use things like low-code, no-code solutions for development. So basically kind of getting back to the roots of what Build was supposed to be.
Do you think they're doing that because it's, they're forced to go remote now?
Yeah, I do. I think all of these events now are going to kind of be more focused and kind of get more straight to the point, because if you have an audience out there watching endless hours of continuous video, you're not going to keep their interest unless you really focus on what they want. And it can't be these giant vision statement keynotes by guys like Satya Nadella, right? It has to be Scott Hanselman demoing tools and showing you how you can develop something yourself at home.
Is there any live component of the Build?
So the keynotes are, quote, live, but they're really taped, right? So what they're doing that's very smart is they're going to re-show all these events in different time zones, so that if you're in Australia, you don't have to get up at 2 a.m. to watch the Satya keynote, which is only going to show one time, right? So all of these, they've got lots of different segments. They're going to have things like live Q&As with Scott Guthrie, for example, who runs the cloud business at Microsoft. But mostly, I would say there are segments that they've already pre-recorded in their studios, and they're going to be having people interact remotely through Teams, so they can talk to engineers while the events are streaming.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just curious, just because I've seen these virtual events, and it seems like everybody's still trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah.
So I guess walk me through Project Reunion and kind of the Windows developer story, which, those guys seem to be forgotten a lot.
I know. I'm kind of happy that they're back to talking to Windows developers again, because it felt for a while like they were way more interested in talking to everybody who wasn't a Windows developer. So at Build this year, they're going to talk about this thing they've called Project Reunion. And what it is the continuation of the strategy they talked about with me last year at Build, where they said, we know we made a mistake by trying to get our existing Win32 developers to write for the Universal Windows platform, because none of them ended up doing it, or very few, I should say. So now they're going back and they're saying, let's instead take our APIs to developers on the Windows wherever they are and make these features available to them as libraries, right? So all you have to do is take your app, your Win32 app, your UWP app, your web app, link in the libraries that Microsoft's providing, things like WinUI 3 and WebView 2, and then it'll work on all Windows 10 devices. Boom. And suddenly, instead of just targeting a tiny segment of their developer population on Windows, they're targeting the 1 billion Windows PCs out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So will this play into, Windows 10X at all?
No, so I was kind of wondering if they were going to talk about 10X at Build, but because it's been kind of I hate to use this word, reimagined. That's their buzzword, right? It was supposed to come out first on dual screen Windows devices, and now they're going to go back and make it so that it works on single screen things like 2-in-1s and clamshell laptops. So they're in the middle of kind of refiguring that now. So I don't think we're actually going to hear almost anything at all about 10X at Build.
Okay. Which is fine for me because honestly, it confused the hell out of me anyway.
We'll have to do a call one time on 10X.
It's a lot. It's a lot to digest.
It is.
So what about this healthcare cloud? You know, as you know, I cover Salesforce, a bunch of other things, and you know, a lot of the Microsoft cloud rivals have, you know, they've gone. I mean, it's the old enterprise software playbook, right? Where you focus on verticals big time.
Yeah.
So Microsoft's launching a healthcare cloud?
Yeah. So like all the other big software companies, Microsoft has a heavy focus on vertical markets. And one of the biggest verticals that they have targeted with their software and services to date is healthcare. So it looks like they're taking a lot of the things they've been working on, especially since COVID began, for the healthcare market, and bundling them together into a cohesive package, right? So you take things like Dynamics 365 marketing and Dynamics 365 customer service and some Power Platform tools and some IoT from Azure, and you kind of mush them all together into a package and then combine them with like a single underlying set of metadata, and that way they all intercommunicate and people can write connectors in to bring in things like third-party payment companies and doctors and hospitals. And then you market it as Microsoft's healthcare cloud. And they're going to say at Build that this is just the first of many of these vertical clouds that they're going to do. So you can imagine them doing finance and retail and maybe like media and entertainment. They haven't said that, but those are all kind of their big vertical markets. So you can figure they're going to do something very similar where they take Dynamics, Office, Windows, mush them together and throw in some connectors and say, here we are. That's your cloud.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I just kind of question why they started with healthcare, but beyond the COVID thing, because, you know, I mean, healthcare is basically run by this company called Epic. It's basically the SAP of healthcare.
Yep.
And, you know, given Microsoft already has partnerships with SAP, you would think the other verticals would go first.
Yeah. I think, you know, it's funny, if you look back at Microsoft's history, they have been trying to be a first-tier player in healthcare for over a decade. Like they bought a bunch of healthcare companies and they sold them off. And the whole big part of their AI and research organization is dedicated specifically to healthcare. So I would say even before COVID, healthcare was one of their maybe top 2 or 3 vertical markets that they've put the most investment and time and technology into. So I actually am not that surprised that healthcare is one of the big ones.
Yeah. So you mentioned AI. Walk me through some of the AI stuff they're going to unveil with this thing.
Yeah, so the one I'm the most interested in, and I'm interested because I had heard tips on this and I couldn't pull it together for a story before Build, but now I'm like, yes, I was right. They're building a supercomputer. So Microsoft, they announced last year they were investing $1 billion in OpenAI, which is that research organization that was formed by Elon Musk and Sam Altman. So they invested $1 billion in them last year, and they said at that time, we're going to be working with them on supercomputer technology. And that's all they said. But I had heard Microsoft was building a supercomputer, and at Build, they're going to announce they've built the 5th most powerful publicly recorded supercomputer in the world. And the reason this is interesting from an AI perspective is Microsoft's been doing a lot with very large AI models. This is what they call Project Turing. And they've discovered that the best way to run a really huge AI model is to run it all at once on a giant computer instead of trying to run a bunch of piece parts broken up into smaller models, even simultaneously or in a distributed way. So what they're going to do is say, the benefit of this is not just going to be for OpenAI. I mean, it's their supercomputer, but all the learnings that we're getting from doing this, we're going to actually be able to improve the AI capabilities and things like Word and PowerPoint and Excel, because we now are figuring out how to run these giant these massive distributed data sets on a supercomputer. And we think the benefits will trickle down to our own customer base that way by kind of harnessing the power of these massive data models on a supercomputer.
So is this a supercomputer they'll sell, or is it something
No.
that you'll access through the cloud somehow, or is this just Microsoft's basically engine, so to speak?
Yeah, so they built this supercomputer for and with OpenAI. So nobody else is going to be able to buy this, and they're not going to make more than one of them. Like it's just this one thing. But because they're collaborating with them, they're going to be able to take the work that they're doing with Project Turing models and then pull it back into Microsoft and then use those models to improve the AI capabilities in their own products. So it's not something like customers will ever be able to rent time on the supercomputer in the cloud. It's not like that. It's not like FPGAs are in that way. It's more benefits from how this actually is implemented will trickle down into the Microsoft product stack.
Okay, so this is basically Microsoft saying, here's what our R&D produced.
Exactly.
This is why you should buy Microsoft or develop it.
Yeah, it's kind of like, here's a little glimpse at our secret sauce, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Walk me through fluid frameworks and the team stuff. I mean,
okay.
It's interesting because, I'd probably say if we talked about this in February, I'd be like, teams, developers, whatever.
Right. Yep.
Now it's all we're hearing about is teams. So
I know.
I guess what is that developer story?
Yeah. So Microsoft is doing a lot of things to try to get other companies to write applications and services that work with Teams. Teams is basically their competitor to Slack, but it's a lot more too. It's not just a group chat platform. Like it's becoming almost an OS in its own right because they're tying everything into Teams. So at Build, they're going to talk about some of the things you can do as a developer with Teams. So things like Power Apps now being directly integrated into Teams, automated workflows directly integrated into Teams, Power BI reports directly integrated into Teams. They're going to talk about some of the new customizable templates that they're making available to developers. So that if you want to develop a vertical application, like a banking application, a healthcare application, that you'll have these templates to start with, and then you can tie into Teams. So that's going to be their story. Like here are all the APIs you need, the templates, the tools, and we're going to show you how to build an app that works with and directly integrates with Teams.
Yeah, I sort of, the biggest thing for Teams, the biggest thing Slack has over Teams is they have all these third-party developers.
Yeah. Yep.
There's, the Google Docs integration. There's just a ton, Jira. I mean, it just goes on and on. Like they have integrations with everybody.
Yep.
And, basically from what you just described, it's kind of like, Teams, it's still a very Microsoft-centric view of the world.
Yeah, although, more and more companies are doing the same thing. Like when they integrate with Slack, they also are now integrating with Teams. And Microsoft even has its own app store inside Teams for all the third-party companies that have built Teams apps. Okay. So it's happening. They're definitely doing some catch-up here. But now that they've got 75 million daily active users on Teams, it looks way more interesting to developers than it did when they were first competing with Slack.
Yeah, what a difference 4 or 5 months makes.
I know, right? Yeah. Yep.
Walk me through, I guess, some of the Azure Stack stuff, and I guess what is the state of Azure Stack as far as the developer goes?
Yeah, it's funny. We haven't heard that much about Azure Stack lately. At Ignite, they announced they were rebranding it as Azure Stack Hub. So if you hear that term, that's really just Azure Stack. What they're doing is mostly incremental stuff here at this point. They're making sure that their apps and some of their leading partners' apps can all work and be managed through Azure Stack. They're adding some new capabilities like fleet management for Azure Stack, but mostly, again, very incremental at this point. Just trying to fill in more customer demand there, especially around healthcare too, and work with people like Red Hat. Make sure their own Kubernetes service works really well on Azure Stack. those kind of announcements for Azure Stack.
Yeah, and I guess Azure Stack's really it's their hybrid
It is
cloud play. And
right.
The weird part about the Azure Stack, Azure Stack Hub, whatever.
Yeah.
Is so much of that depends on, their partners getting the integrated systems into the field.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
So it's a Microsoft play, but it totally depends on how Lenovo, Dell, HPE, and those guys do.
It does. Right. Because they're the ones who are selling them, right? Not Microsoft doesn't sell Azure Stack.
Yeah.
The server vendors sell it.
Yeah. It's just it's kind of a weird arrangement. What about Project Cortex, which is, we're kind of seeing this where, more cloud providers are trying to tie in more context to stuff and AI. And, does this thing stand a shot?
Yeah. So Project Cortex is Microsoft's knowledge management service. It's coming in Microsoft 365 early summer 2020. Like, it's going to be generally available early this summer, which is kind of crazy because as of now, it's still in private preview with only a handful of companies, like about 75 companies. So they're going to go directly from private preview to general availability in Microsoft 365. And what Cortex lets you do is kind of bring contextual information to the forefront. So say you're working in a team and you're working on a bunch of documents with a bunch of people, it'll give you contact cards and say, here are the people who are in this team. Here's where they sit in your organization or outside your organization. Here are the documents you last worked with them on. It kind of brings all this knowledge to the forefront for you as a user. It'll do a lot of other things too around preserving cultural knowledge, like a traditional knowledge management system, but that's kind of where it's going to start, I think, inside of Microsoft 365. And so here at Build this week, they're going to be talking about developer tools for Project Cortex being in private preview. This is really important because when you pull all this information and you don't want it just to be limited to knowing about Microsoft apps and Microsoft services, you want it to also know about third-party services. So you need companies to build into Microsoft's managed metadata system and to tie into the Microsoft Graph. So they're going to have all kinds of new tools for doing this for the companies who are in private preview, and then ultimately for the end user community when this becomes available.
Yeah, because I would imagine if this doesn't tie into like Salesforce,
right,
it's kind of useless.
Well, that's the thing. Microsoft's doing all this metadata connectivity with various vendors, but the one I don't think they've pulled in is Salesforce, and you can kind of understand why, given the rivalry around Dynamics 365. But yeah, they're trying to pull everybody in that they can, including vertically specialized applications and services too.
What about the weird thing for this, where I appreciate the contextual data and all that being pulled in?
Yeah.
What do you think the line's going to be between being helpful and annoying?
And also privacy, right? Because when you tell people about this, they're like, wait a minute, I don't want that, right? Like, I don't want someone knowing where I sit in my organization. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of opt-in. It's going to be if your company is all in on Microsoft Search and having an indexing system crawling your own applications and services internally. It's almost like turning your company's data into a private intranet that your company will be able to search and have information surfaced. I'm sure they're very attuned to the privacy aspects of this because it won't work without that. And it has to be obviously opt-in for developers and for companies who would be using the service. So yeah, there are a lot of what ifs for sure to make sure this works right.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking in my head, well, if they screw this up, it's just going to be like a smarter Clippy.
Yeah, everybody says, isn't this just Clippy 2.0? I'm like,
yeah,
it's a little different.
That way. I mean, with a better name, right? It sounds smarter.
Yeah, I think it's also Clippy was more like tips, like tool tips, right? And this is more like, here's how you derive information that is of value to you in operational sense for your company. So it's a very different kind of spin on this, I feel like.
Yeah, but yeah, that delivery, I'm thinking, some kind of brain thing that's gonna be annoying. Some cartoon brain, like I can already see it. Anything we didn't cover about this that's coming down the pike?
You know, we mentioned it, but we didn't really delve into it. Fluid Framework is another big thing everybody's going to hear about this week. And so Fluid Framework is something Microsoft made a really big deal out of at Build last year. And it was very, very early days. So nobody really kind of understood what it was. It was kind of like like super fast collaboration meets embedded documents. And everybody was like, what? So at Build this week,
what?
yeah. So at this week, they're going to actually have the Fluid Framework available in public preview, and they're also going to announce they're open sourcing the Fluid Framework technologies. So what it does is it lets you take things like tables and charts and task lists and insert them into things like Outlook on the web, so that when sales numbers are updated in one place, it'll automatically update them everywhere this information is inserted, and it won't be a case of having to wait for it to sync or hope that it's synced. It'll just always be up to date because of the fast collaboration technology and the way that the technology is componentized. So they're going to start out showing you how that works in Office.com and Outlook.com and Outlook on the web, and then kind of let people see how that, like, get their head around that, and then say, and if you want to use these kinds of components in your own applications, we've open sourced this, so you can take Fluid Framework and you can build this kind of instantaneous collaboration and sync technology right into your own apps.
So this, in theory, would work for Excel?
It would, in theory, work for Excel.
Okay. Well, if they just solve that, the one source of the truth, and updating a bunch of Excel docs,
that's a big deal.
that it justifies the whole existence of the thing completely.
It does. It does.
Especially when I'm still stunned by how many companies run on Excel, and people sending numbers around. Like, it boggles the mind, but it's still happening. So
it is.
You might as well just give them some crutch to keep everything, updated.
Yep, I know. Excel is kind of like the secret ingredient still in so many solutions, right? And yeah, if this does work the way it's being advertised, it would be a game changer. So
yeah, definitely. All right. Anything else to cover?
I think that's it. I hope, anyway. Man, there's a lot of news. There's going to be a lot of kind of developer tool focused news around .NET and the languages and all the things you would expect at a developer conference, ASP.NET, Blazor. But I think it'll be more interesting to their core developer audience, just because that will be the focus front and center, instead of trying to show off all the latest and greatest futuristic stuff that they think people want to see.
Right. All right. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry.